you will learn about Azure Managed DevOps Pools, a managed build agent that will be used by Azure DevOps and that will be injected into your virtual network. This feature is available to resolve a problem. What is that problem? Customers that uses Azure services will respect the best practices in terms of security. So they will put all of their services in private mode. This means that they will use private endpoints, and this means that if they want to deploy to these services using Azure DevOps, then they have two options for choosing the build agent. So they can choose the Microsoft managed build agent, which is hosted on Microsoft virtual network, and with this way, for that build agent to access the customer virtual network, the customer will need to open the inbound traffic for that build agent, and this means that the customer will need to open lots of IP addresses, and those IP addresses changes each week, so the customer needs to maintain that IP addresses. The second option, which is the most interesting option, is to use the self-hosted build agents. So Microsoft gives you the executable file that will run the build agent, but it's up to you to deploy it into an Azure virtual machine. And that's the issue. You will need to provision an Azure virtual machine inside of your subnet or your VNET, and then that VM, because it's inside your VNET, it will have access to your Azure resources. So most of these resources are PaaS services, for one exception, that is the DevOps build agent. This one is IaaS service. It's a virtual machine, so the customer needs to maintain it, needs to update that virtual machine. As you can expect with the name of this new service, Managed DevOps Pools, this means that this part now will not be a IaaS service, but will be a PaaS service that will be managed by Microsoft. So for today in Azure DevOps, if you want to use a build agent, you either choose the Microsoft hosted pool agent, or you can use your own virtual machine to install a build agent. But note that there is also a third option that is using VMSS, virtual machine scale set. This is available in Azure DevOps because you can link Azure DevOps to your Azure subscription, and then Azure DevOps will manage that VMSS in terms of scalability and provisioning. So each one of these options have its own advantages and also drawbacks. So for Azure pipelines, those are build agents that are managed only by Microsoft. You don't have access to the virtual machines that host those build agents. So for that, you cannot install custom software on these images, and they are hosted on Microsoft owned virtual network. They are not in your own virtual network, so they don't have direct access to your private resources behind private endpoint, and you don't have lots of choice in terms of the compute that is available behind those build agents in terms of CPU and memory and disk space. For the second option, which is the self-hosted agent pools, its disadvantage is that it's really tough to manage. You need to upgrade the VMs, you need to define policies for that VM, you need to define access, you need to provide a backup plan, and so on. For the third option, VMSS virtual machine scale set, it suffers from some performance issues because it will try to always downscale to 0. So this means when you start a new pipeline, you will need to wait until the VMSS creates the instances, and that usually takes between 2 to 3 minutes. Unless you keep some instances idle, and in that case you trade off performance for cost. So then Microsoft created the new offering in Azure, that is the Managed DevOps Pools, in order to provide a solution for all of these issues. So at the end, it's still yet a build agent that is available in Azure DevOps, but it's managed by Azure. It's completely managed by Azure, so you see it as a managed PaaS service, not anymore as a virtual machine IaaS service. In addition to that, it could be injected into your Azure virtual network. You can provide your custom image from a gallery, but you can also use the Azure pipeline images that are used to run the Microsoft hosted build agents. This means that you don't have to create a custom image that contains the dozens or the hundreds of the tools that should be installed inside the build agent. You just use the Microsoft provided one, which have lots of pre-configured command line tools, and so it's highly scalable. It can scale up to 1000 agents, And you can define a pool that contains different kind of images or different VM SKU. It supports a lot of platform architectures, supports multiple distributions of Linux and Windows. When you create the managed DevOps pool, you can associate it with one or multiple organizations, and you can associate it to all the projects within the organization, or you can limit it to some specific projects. But how much does this service will cost you? Actually, the cost will be the cost of the compute resources that will be created behind this service. So you typically use for the use of the virtual machines behind this service. Azure Managed DevOps pools will rely on Dev Center in order to create the required infrastructure. So for that, you will need to provision first a Dev Center and a project. So now our issue and our problem should be resolved. So instead of using the DevOps self-hosted build agent, that is the IaaS service, now you can replace it with Managed DevOps pool. That will be completely managed by Azure, and that will live within a subnet you choose, so then it will have access to your private resources. Follow me in the next video where we'll go through a demonstration for how to create an Azure Managed DevOps, how to configure the build agents, and then how to run an Azure DevOps YAML pipeline that will use the DevOps pool in order to run that pipeline. In this video demonstration, we'll learn how to use the Azure Managed DevOps pool. For that, we'll start first by creating the Azure Managed DevOps pool as part of the Dev Center. It will live in its own subnet that is part of this virtual network. And then we'll provision and configure the configuration for the build agents, where we'll use the Ubuntu VMs. And then from Azure DevOps, we'll go to run a pipeline using this Managed DevOps agent. I'll start here from my Azure subscription, where I have already created a Managed DevOps pool, the Dev Center, the project, and the virtual network. I'll show you how I have created these resources. So I started with the virtual network, where here I've defined a subnet for my DevOps build agent. I've called it default. And note that the important thing here is that for that subnet, it should have the subnet delegation. So it should use the Microsoft.DevOps infrastructure /pools. So make sure you don't forget to configure that. And then next, during the configuration of the managed DevOps pool, you will need to assign a role for the service principal that will be used by Dev Center or by the DevOps pool. So actually it will need two roles. So you'll need to assign it the network contributor role, and you need also to assign it the reader role for your DevOps infrastructure. By default, the SPN will be called DevOps infrastructure. After that, you can proceed to the creation of the Dev Center, or directly you can also proceed to the creation of the Managed DevOps pools, and in the template, it will ask you to create a Dev Center. Let's see how that works. So if I look here for Managed DevOps pool, I will see this type of service here. So I have already one, but let's go to create a new. So you choose the resource group, and then you choose your Dev Center and your project, and you create one if you don't. And then you choose the Azure DevOps organization. And this should be the name of your Azure DevOps organization. So for my case, for example, it's this name right here, Hosam Delay. So I need to provide into here. And for that, pay attention. You need to have the Azure DevOps organization and Azure using the same Azure Active Directory. That's what I have done here from my Azure DevOps organization, where from within Microsoft Entra, from the organization settings, you should make sure that the tenant ID that you are using is the same one that you are using in your Azure subscription. Otherwise, you can go to switch directory and choose the one you want. That's required because here when you mention the name of your organization, the identity that will look for your Azure DevOps organization, it will go through the Azure Active Directory or the Entra ID. Then next, we need to provide a pool name. I'll give it a name like this, and then we should choose a region where the service will be provisioned. I'll continue with North Europe, for example. And then here you can specify the maximum agents. I'll put 10, for example, but not here. We have an issue. So you'll need to pay attention to the quota. So for each SKU, you would have a specific quota, but you can go to increase that quota if you want to. And then next, we have the configuration for the agent side or the agent size. This is the virtual machine that will run the managed DevOps agent. So default chosen size is the D2 ADS, but you can go to change that size, and here you will have all the VM sizes that are available in North Europe for me. So don't just ignore that this is telling me this is not available because I'm testing this during the preview time. But once the service is GA, you should see all of these SKU that will be available. So you can choose the general D series. So you have multiple options right here. And you can also choose the VMs that comes with a GPU, like the N series and many. For me here, I'll continue with this VM. And then next, this VM would have an OS disk. So it's up to you to choose what kind of OS disk that is, whether that is a standard HDD or a standard SSD or a premium. Each time you increase the performance of the disk. For this demonstration, I'll continue with the standard. And then for the choice of the image, we can click here, add from image library, and we get here really lots of options. So first option is the easiest option for you, where here you can choose the build agents VMs that are provided by Microsoft. So those are the Microsoft hosted VMs, and Microsoft is offering you those VMs, so you can choose their same configuration. That's the easiest option because those VMs have already lots of tools that are installed there. So in most of the cases, you don't need to install any additional tools there unless you have some custom tools within your company. Note, for each one, you have a link for a list of the softwares that are available here. Let's choose this one, for example. And here you see we have, it's based on Ubuntu 22.04. And those are the list of the installed software. So you have Bash, MS Build, Node.js, Python, Ruby, Swift, and you have lots of package management tools like npm, NuGet, pip. You have Conda already installed, Maven, Gradle, Ansible, Bicep, Terraform, Docker installed, Git already installed, Podman, Pulumi. So note that this GitHub project is the one provided by GitHub itself for its runners. So here you will find the scripts that will help you to rebuild the same image if you want to. Let's go back to our options, where we have here a second option that is selected marketplace images. So those are the VM images that are available within the Microsoft Azure Marketplace. And you have a third option where you can bring your own image. So you can create your own image, put it in your gallery, and then from here you can choose that image. For our demonstration today, let's continue with the easiest option. I'll choose here Azure Pipelines Ubuntu 22.04, click Add, and that will add it to the list. I can delete this default provided VM, but I'll keep it for my demonstration. Then next, we have the scaling options. And here you configure the agent state. So either you say, I want to get a new fresh agent every time. It means that in each pipeline execution, Azure will provide you a new VM that doesn't have any data from your previous execution. Or you can say, I want to keep the same agent. I want to use it for multiple executions. And here you can specify the maximum time to live and the grace period. Then you have an interesting configuration, which is the standby agent mode. So when your build agents are not running any pipeline, the default behavior is that Azure Managed DevOps pool will delete the virtual machine. And that's in order to save you cost, because at the end you pay for the cost of those VMs, the cost of the infrastructure. But the trade-off with that is that the next time you will need to run another pipeline, you will need to wait for the creation of that virtual machine. And that might take about 2 minutes. If you don't want that, then you have two options, either to configure manually when your pool should start, when it should finish, or you can configure it to start and finish automatically. I'll continue with the standby agent mode off. And then next is the networking configuration. And this is the important part, where here you can keep it isolated from your virtual network. It means it will be hosted within Microsoft virtual network, or you can attach it to your own virtual network. And here you should provide your virtual network and also a subnet. For that, I've created the virtual network prior to creating this resource. So I'll continue with that configuration, and I'll move next to the storage. So in the basics, we have configured the OS disk type right here. But here in the storage, we can attach another disk that will be the data disk. So you can specify a size. Let's say here I want to attach a disk with 128 gigabytes. And then you can configure the caching type, the storage type. I'll continue with the standard LRS, local redundant storage, but note that you have lots of other options. And for the driver letter, I'll choose the letter F, for example. I'll move next to the security part, where here we have the option to choose this managed DevOps pool in one or multiple organizations. If we keep this configuration by default, it means it's one organization. If we click here, then it means here it will support multiple organizations. So I have already provided my organization, but here I can also add more organizations, and they can specify which specific projects that should have access to this build agents. Note that you can configure the parallelism for each project. And if you are using UI tests, then you can enable the interactive mode. And then in terms of security comes the question, who should be able to administer this resource? So you have three options, either the creator only, or you should inherit from the permissions from the project, or it should be some specific accounts, and here you can specify those accounts. I'll continue with creator only for this demonstration. And then I'll go to review and after that, you should click create, and then you should have all your resources created, which I have here from this resource. So you should see all of these resources except for the managed identity that I've created later. Great, so at this time we can now access to the managed DevOps pools and see its configuration. So from the overview page, we can view to which organization is attached to. And then we can see the pool users. So those are the experiments that I have run before starting this demonstration. We can see some traffic going here. And then next within the settings, we can move to the pools where we'll see here to each dev center this is attached to, and note we can move it from one dev center to another. We can reconfigure the DevOps organization. We can reconfigure also the maximum build agents, the agent size, the OS disk type, the images, and so on. So note here in the images we have provided two images, and the second one have a default alias. Note here we have this option to add a new alias if we want to. We'll see in a minute why this is important. Next, in the settings, if we go to the scaling section, we can review the configuration that we have specified during the creation of this managed DevOps pool. And then next, within the configuration section, the networking, we can see to which VNET and subnet this is attached, and then we can change this subnet if we want to. Then next, in the storage, so we can see the disk that we have attached to that VM, and we can change its configuration. Within security, we can see who have access to this DevOps pools, which organizations. So from here, we can reconfigure it to add extra organizations. And then here, I'm setting this DevOps pool in order to be restricted, and only this project in my Azure DevOps organization could have access to this managed DevOps pool. And then within the identity part, note here I have attached that managed identity that I have created. That should be user managed identity. So you can use it in order to access your Azure resources. And then within the agents section, we can view here, I have two agents available. Those are idle agents. Note here the status is ready. So they are waiting for a pipeline to run. So then let's run a pipeline and let's see how it will run its steps within this managed DevOps build agent. So now in my Azure DevOps organization, I can go to check for the agent pools, and from here I can see the Azure managed pipelines, and I can see also the one created by managed DevOps pool, which is this one in my case. If I click there, you can see some of the pipelines that I have run before starting this demonstration. Great, and that means that managed DevOps was configured correctly in your Azure DevOps. Now for trying to run a pipeline, here I've created a new project within my Azure DevOps organization, and I've used a main.python file right here, and I've created a sample Docker file that will go to run that Python application into a Docker container. And then I've created the Azure pipelines.yaml file that we can see clearly right here. And here I've defined one stage with multiple jobs. So I have 3 jobs actually. First job will run on a pool that have the name of my agent pool, which is Azure-mdp-neu. It will try to run a Docker container or build a Docker container, and then the second job will run on the same pool, but it will use this image override demand. And the third job will try to use the Azure login using the managed identity that is attached to the Azure DevOps build. And then it will try to query my resources. Great, let's run this. Click run, run again. So now here we have the three jobs are in queued state. This means that they are waiting for the build agent in the managed DevOps pool to be ready. So if I go back to the agents, hit refresh, then we see three agents that will be provisioned. And here we can see one of the jobs finished its execution, and that's the job that will go to try to use AZ CLI in order to log into my Azure subscription and then retrieve the resource group and retrieve the resources within the current resource. If I refresh here this state, note that here one of the states is pending reimage. That's because I want in each job execution, I want to create a new fresh image. So it will be reimaged each time. Then once the first job will start running, it will finish with an error here because it didn't locate or it didn't find Docker installed inside the virtual machine. Why is that? So if we take a look at that first job, we can see when we have defined the pool, we have defined only the name of the pool. This means that here, if I go back to the pools, so in our pool, we have two VMs. One VM that is Ubuntu server, so it does not have any additional tool installed, and Docker is not installed here. And we have a second VM that is provided by Microsoft DevOps build agent where Docker is installed inside this VM. And note here the difference is that the second VM uses an alias, whether the first one does not use an alias. And when I specify only the name of the DevOps pool, then this will choose the VM that does not have an alias, which is the VM that does not have Docker installed. For that, the pipeline fails. For the second job, it did actually build successfully the Docker image, as you can see in the status right here. And that's because in the second job, we have chosen the right build agent. So in addition to the pool name, we have specified demands, where here we override, image override equals Ubuntu 2204. That's the alias that is coming from the Azure pipeline provided pool right here. And that was how to use Azure Managed DevOps pool with Azure DevOps to run build pipelines. Thank you.